So I'm going to introduce the speakers for this presentation, who are Petra, Marko and Jennifer Ross from Velocity. Hello, and I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I can't see Petra, but I'm sure she's here.
Hi, Jennifer. I am.
Hi. Brilliant. You're going to share your screen so we can begin. Good evening, everyone. As introduced, I'm Jennifer Ross, and that's Petra there. And we are one of 6 individuals who are promoting this, who have created this sort of initiative called, or we call it Velocity, Velocity, but what it is, it's about regenerating and growing villages in a sustainable way. And as introduced, there is this idea of the 15-minute city, which is very relevant to the cities and Paris, which you probably all heard about, but you may not think it's particularly relevant to villages. So we're going to talk about this initiative that we developed in 2017. Okay, next slide, Petra. And why are we doing it? Rural areas make up 85% of the land, 18% of the population. There is housing pressure in the countryside, and there are over 100,000 villages in England. But planning policy to date has been very much about constraining villages, rightly so, because they're some of the most sort of precious parts of our countryside. But if you were to think about the future and, how might we think about the village in the 21st century? Next slide. And why would we want to do that? And as you've probably all experienced in our rural areas, increasing congestions and all the sort of bad side effects of that on air quality and pollution, an aging population, sort of house prices rising, people getting older with not sort of facilities closing down in urban areas. And there's quite a lot of problems. There's a lot of good things about the sort of villages, but underneath there are these problems of aging, unhealthy living, car dependency, people being priced out, which you probably, many of you may have experienced as the supply becomes constrained and less building happens, prices rise. And increasingly, and particularly as we've lived through COVID, and particularly amongst elderly, increasing social isolation. And that's something that we wanted to tackle. Now, to say that sort of villages are sort of constrained, there has been growth, and it's been incremental growth, and sort of unplanned growth. And we sort of felt that there is a much more positive and holistic way to look at villages and how they've grown, how they've grown historically, and how they might grow in the future. But that needs to be planned for rather than just letting little bits of development happen. And we wanted to take a much more sort of holistic view to how we grow our villages in the future. Next slide. So the initiative is by 6 people that all met on bicycles and talked a lot about how we wanted to plan. We're planners, architects, engineers, landscape architects, and general sort of public realm, and interested in planning as a holistic activity. So this initiative came about, and we entered a competition in about 2017, the National Infrastructure Competition run by the NIC, which was to look specifically at the Oxford-Cambridge corridor. And as you probably know, there's, it's enormous pressure there. About 1 million new homes had to be accommodated there to 2050. And it was an idea of how can we do this in a sensitive and a sort of holistic way to look at how we could accommodate that growth. So we looked at that corridor, and we looked at the stations along there. And one of the things that struck us, we cycled all over it, was there were lots and lots of small villages, but connected close to stations. And we thought, well, actually, one of the things we're going to look at is clusters of villages, and at sort of growing them in a sort of incremental way. And this illustrates the proposition. And along there is the rail link at the middle with the station. But clusters of, sort of up to about 10 villages around those stations, all connected by existing roads and all within about 2 miles of each other. But traditional planning policy had sort of seen that none of those individual villages were sustainable in their own right. And what we said, well, what if you think of them as a cluster, and that they're a sort of symbiotic cluster that supports each other, and that they are, looked at in a holistic way. And underpinning the strategy is very much about seeing the station as the point where you connect to the wider area, but seeing the strategy very much as something that is switching from the car to movement by walking and by cycling, and taking the car, very much downgrading the car. So you only use the car for longer journeys, but when you're in the cluster, it's very much about walking, cycling safely. And so the strategy was very much about seeing that collection of villages and thinking about how that they could operate as a symbiotic cluster, working together. Next slide. And I'm going to hand over to Petra now to take you through some of the detail of how that strategy evolves.
So in the animation here, you can see Jennifer's point about the incremental growth and how these clusters would transform over time. And in between these villages, the green area that's growing, that you can see, is what we call the big back garden. And the idea is very much about having some productive landscape, such as allotments or orchards near the villages, where people can have a degree of self-sufficiency in terms of local food production. Of course, there will still need to be deliveries from elsewhere, but we can increase the local production through having those allotments near the villages. But then also in perpetuity, protecting and enhancing the landscape and biodiversity and ecology of the landscape. So we all know that through climate emergency, actually, and through intensive farming practices, landscape has been downgraded, and we've seen wildflower meadows disappearing and bees, etc. in the UK. So this strategy is about enhancing the landscape and protecting it for the future generations. So that's the point to natural landscape. And the active landscape is the idea that this landscape also becomes a focal point for the village cluster, for the communities to come together, and each village cluster could have a different focus, could become an attraction from further, so people could come and visit specific village clusters for something that cluster is famous for, whether it's a focus on water or leisure or culture or food. And it is very much an idea about sharing economy and not having all services in each village, but having a cluster of villages where in each village you would have certain services. So you could have a medical facility in one village and you can have a school in another village. And by making those cycle and walking paths across the fields between the cluster, you will make it easier for children to get to school independently and to have less reliance on the car. And that idea of the sharing economy goes all the way to any of the new housing and the way that this can be developed. So in terms of scale, when we're talking about these clusters, and a 7-mile radius of this cluster of villages is what a child or an elderly person can comfortably cycle. So we're not talking about large distances. And just as a comparison, on the left-hand side, you can see the study cluster of villages that we looked at close to Winslow town centre station. And on the right-hand side is Richmond Park, just to give you a sense of the scale and the cyclability and walkability of these clusters, which we have, as Jennifer said, cycled ourselves and experienced. We've also talked to a number of people in the villages who also are running independent businesses and how they see them evolving. So historically, each village had evolved either around a manor or around the village green or around a farm. And our strategy is about retaining the special character of each village. We looked at the housing and building typologies in villages and taking clues from these as to what type of new development we might see as sustainable for the future growth. And the number 5 and 6 on the right hand side is the kind of newer type of development, low density cul-de-sac or linear sprawl, which we felt is actually not really conducive to preserving that special character of the villages, and it creates more car dependency. It kind of sprawls the villages out and doesn't help. So we came up with an idea of this spatial plan and design code, which is very much about retaining the village core. So the green area that you can see is the existing village. The lines to the green are showing that actually we want to preserve certain views onto the green, but also preserving views to certain landmark buildings like the church or the manor. And then the pink are what we call housing fields, which quite often you can see in rural areas that there would be a new development far away from an existing village and town. It would need new roads and infrastructure built, and it would be completely disconnected from the local village and the existing services. So our spatial plan is about actually building tightly around that village core to a higher density, taking cues from the existing housing typologies that are already there. And then we looked at a different range of housing types that could be suitable in villages in preserving their character, and also live-work typologies. I mean, it's interesting, just statistics just before COVID, 22% home workers were based in rural areas, and we certainly will see an increase post-COVID and during COVID of people working from home. So this gives us more flexibility to think about actually the quality of life that people want to have, and more people wanting to have access to open countryside and be based in more rural areas, which could make them more sustainable as there's more critical mass of people to reinvigorate some of the local services. So this image is showing what we call an imagined velocity village, where the gray are is the existing village core. And then on the top, you can see the scale of the building. So when we are talking about higher density housing, we're actually not talking about skyscrapers or something overpowering to the local vernacular. We are talking about housing that's actually always in tune with the existing and not overshadowing the local landmarks such as the church. And here are a couple of images that show the new housing in the context of the village on the right hand side, and on the left hand side how this new housing might feel. One of these housing fields tightly clustered around the village core, where children can play safely, can move around, increasing social encounters, which again helps with loneliness and social isolation for elderly people. So since 2017, we have been, basically the competition was an ideas competition, which didn't lead to any direct commission for us, but we have been talking to various government bodies, and we have presented our vision to different forums. We have participated and been selected to take part in the Oslo Architecture Triennale, which was about the idea of how we look at growth in context of climate emergency. So in Oslo, we have launched our Velocity Manifesto and our principles that we have consolidated since winning the competition. We have also built partnerships with the people like Brompton, who are making the foldable bicycles and are very interested to expand into rural areas where they can see this opportunity of multimodal movement. So you can take the bicycle to the train station, then you can take your bicycle on the train, you get off in the town or city where you're going to, and then you continue your journey. So that makes it really convenient. We also won the William Sutton Prize for social housing and placemaking from Clarion Housing Group. And currently we are working for Blenheim Estate on a vision and strategy to implement the principles of velocity on their estate, and Jennifer will talk a little bit more about that. In terms of the housing and this idea of we could call it gentle density, and this is something that also the new National Design Guide mentions, and the government's commission, Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, talks about the idea of gentle density. And when we look at existing villages, we have actually undertaken further research since winning the competition, thanks to the RIBA research funding, and went to, for instance, Dent in Cumbria, which is a historic village built at very high density, very compact, walkable. They have a grass-screed parking in front of the village, which actually blends in with the landscape. So there's lots of interesting lessons to be learned from some of these case studies. We also went to Pambury in Dorset, that's quite low density, but there were some interesting urban design ideas to look at. And then again, very high density, also with prestige development in Sweden called Jakriborg, and more modern approaches in Cambridge with Marmalade Lane, and by Husen in Copenhagen, which is row housing at 100 dwellings per hectare. So I mentioned also Trinala in our manifesto, and in summary, just the principles that we have consolidated about velocity, and that me and Jennifer had talked through now. So first of all, we think it's about people over cars and creating those new movement networks, but using existing bridleways and pathways. So we don't need to actually have a huge capital spending to implement this strategy. It can be implemented very quickly at a very low cost. We're actually not saying that we're taking the car out of the equation completely. We are phasing the car out over time by giving people a more convenient way of making those short journeys on a daily basis. The second very important principle is about housing being compact, close or within and around the village core to prevent the sprawl that I showed earlier. And it's about the idea of the sharing economy, so connected, not isolated, having the clusters of villages to benefit everyone, and being able to reinvigorate some of the local services, but also bring in more potential for entrepreneurship and new work opportunities in rural areas, so that people are not simply living there and always commuting. So this is the idea of opportunity over decline. And last but important principle is about the ecology and biodiversity and protecting the landscape. So Jennifer will.
Yeah. So in summary, it's a sort of holistic approach to planning the future growth of groups of villages, and underpinning that, as well as all the design issues we talk about, the movement issues, the infrastructure planning. There is also a sort of detailed delivery strategy about how money raised from housing release gets recycled into the villages to help sustain them in the longer term. So it's rather than just sort of seeing bits of housing come forward, it's actually thinking of a sort of holistic way of planning the future of groups of villages. And as a result of the back of this, we're now working with Blenheim on, this is a very sort of unique opportunity in the sense that they own all the land around Blenheim, and they own sort of several villages, and they have very much embraced this sort of strategy that we've been talking about in relation to sort of 8 villages that surround Blenheim, and the potential of introducing new villages, all connected by cycle networks and walking networks, but also linking back to nearby stations. And very much some of the planning we've been looking at is very much looking different. They're their own developers, so we're looking very differently about how we plan for the future. And on the left is a very interesting sort of statistic that is about a typical housing development, typical suburban housing development. And then on the right is the Velocity principle, and we're very much about, you can see the big grey sort of allocation to roads and parking in a traditional village, and you can see in the Velocity way of a planning, it's taking that 40% down to 13%, and very much thinking differently about how you plan for the car, where you put the car, and very much giving space over to community courtyards, ecological, greening, and the building footprint. So it's taking a much more holistic approach to planning and not putting the engineering and the car movement at the forefront, but very much thinking of the character of place. And that's been key to the work we've been doing. And also taking apart all the movements people make, and planning for that actively, you know, from the daily commute to the school run, to the weekly shop, to the commute, to the family weekend, to the kids' school bus, to sort of movement, you know, how elderly people move and how kids move, and planning for every journey so that we can start to take out and plan proactively for all the movements. So the only reason for using the car are for longer journeys and less frequently, and very much linking things together and thinking about the place, very much, you know, in the sort of Holland model, and you know, where you sort of actually actively plan for this, and you don't actually have to go on roads where cars are, and actively putting in cycle routes and walking. And so, you know, now we're sort of in the sort of process of, we think that the strategy is starting to get some traction, particularly in the COVID lockdown. We're seeing it as a sort of route that is very practical, low cost and incremental, something that can be done slowly. It does transform. It can be transformative, turning planning on its head, and, you know, rather than just saying villages are not sustainable, but actually thinking proactively about how we plan for the growth of villages in the future, and that can have a real and positive impact on people's lives. And we think it is replicable across our country, and we sort of think that that it is something that we would, you know, that we should get hold of in the future planning, and really sort of proactively plan for our rural areas, and sort of, rather than sort of constraining it totally, do something where we actually think about holistically about how our rural areas want to grow in the